welcome. All right. A few people joining us. Hi, Emma, Jennifer.
Hello. Found the meeting passcode. That was a little tricky.
You passed the test. All right, maybe I'll wait a little bit longer. See, I think we're expecting a few more people. Looks like Rob's here. Hey, Rob. Christina. Kirsten. All right, well, maybe that's good to get started. Maybe we'll have some folks join us as I'm talking. Hello, my name is Kevin Young. I'm a senior urban planner with Department of Land Conservation and Development. I'm here with our CFAC team, Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities team. Bill Holmstrom and I are the project managers for this effort. Also, Matt Kroll is with us, Cody Meyer, Evan Manbell. We also have our deputy director, Kirsten Green, has joined us, and Ingrid and Casaria Taylor are both here helping us to manage the logistics of this meeting. So the meeting is being recorded. Let's go ahead and have folks introduce themselves from elsewhere. I'll just kind of go through the Hollywood squares here. Heather, why don't you begin?
Hi, I'm Heather O'Donnell. I'm a senior planner with the City of Eugene.
And then let's next have Emma, Jennifer, and Christina.
Emma Newman, senior transportation planner with the City of Springfield.
Jennifer Willer, I'm the acting city engineer for Eugene.
And I'm Christina Kras. I'm the assistant city attorney for the City of Springfield. I work with development and public works on projects like writing new code.
All right, welcome. Let's have Rob and Michael and Terry.
Hi, I'm Rob Innerfeld, Transportation Planning Manager for the City of Eugene.
Are you talking to me? I'm Michael Liebler, City of Springfield Transportation Planning Engineer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Terry Harding, Principal Planner for the City of Eugene.
All right. And then I think last person I see is Molly.
Hi, I'm Molly Markarian, Senior Planner with the City of Springfield.
All right, welcome. I see Brian Hurley is also joining us just now from ODOT. Welcome, Brian. I think he'll just be sitting in on the meeting. But if you'd like to introduce yourself, Brian, go ahead.
Hello, thanks, Kevin. Yes, I'm Brian Hurley from the ODOT Climate Office, and I'm here to listen and learn.
All right. All right. So hopefully you're seeing a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to just kind of step through the first few slides. Thanks for joining us today. What we intend to do in the next 2 hours is to provide an overview of the current rule drafts, how it would apply in the Central Lane region, and allow some time for some questions and also discussion of the specifics of how these rules might be implemented within the region. So this is generally the script we're following. We want to make sure that we allocate enough time so that we can get through all of the rules. Our goal is to touch on really 7 areas of the rules. And what we are aiming to do is have a very brief staff overview of those rules, maybe 5 minutes, and allow us about 10 minutes of time for questions and discussion. If there's additional time at the end, we can come back to other topics of interest. So that's kind of our plan. We will also be sending out a follow-up survey after the meeting, and there will be other opportunities. So if some of the conversation today prompts you to want to provide more feedback for us, there's a number of ways that you can do that. This slide shows, per the current rule draft, the applicability of various requirements within the region. So the scenario planning is the first row there, with the work program by December 31, the regional scenario plan 1 year later, and so on. And then we have this kind of broken out in terms of the local governments. Coburg, as you can see, as a small community, would have parking requirements. Eugene, you'll see CFA DES is designation. That's the designation of climate-friendly areas, along with parking requirements. CFA zone is the 1 year later, the adoption of zoning requirements and comprehensive plan amendments to implement the climate-friendly areas. We've also included H&A updates. So per the current schedule for H&A updates 2026, I think is Eugene's next scheduled date. And then as you can see, also requirements for Lane County and Springfield. So I'm going to turn the mic over now to Evan Manvell to step us through kind of some of the background of the rulemaking.
Thanks, Kevin. Evan Manvell, he, him pronouns. I'm a land use transportation planner here. We realize that the draft rules are a significant undertaking, somewhat for us, but generally for the local governments who have to implement them. So why are we taking such significant steps? A few reasons. First, we are way far away from meeting our climate pollution reduction goals that Oregon has to do. Our legislature set, our governor has strengthened, and we kind of adopted lots of plans saying we're going to really cut our climate pollution, and we are failing to do so in a significant way from transportation. If what we're doing continues, we're going to have 4 times as much transportation pollution as we said we would in 2050. So that has real world impacts in terms of extreme weather events. You know, the Oregonians who died during the heat bomb last year, earlier this year, and thousands of people made homeless due to wildfires. Extreme weather really impacts us, and climate change is critical. We need to do more faster. Next slide. The second guiding principle is equity. We have a disgraceful legacy when it comes into inequity and racism and discrimination. Some of that has been applied through our land use and transportation decisions, where we've located highways, how we've used zoning as a tool when redlining was outlawed. And what that's meant is those people who got in, generally the white privileged folks, have a lot more wealth than Black households. Intergenerational wealth is passed generally through housing. So that means the average white household today has roughly 10 times as much wealth as the average Black household. So we've added to this, and we have to take action to address inequities. Those are just a couple to highlight. Next slide. The third reason is we really need to rethink what our communities are about. The types of households have changed dramatically since we've adopted some of our plans. The nuclear family used to be the dominant form of household, and as the chart from AARP on the left shows, it's now 1 out of every 5 households, while single-person households are about 1 in every 3. That single-person chart is projected to go up for the next couple of decades, so that kind of provides us some opportunities to rethink what sort of housing and what sort of community shapes might meet the need of those households. Next slide. So the governor realized we were way far off from meeting our climate pollution reduction goals, and she directed us and other state agencies last March to take aggressive action to correct our off-courseness, I guess I would say. Said, hey, do everything you can to meet our climate pollution reduction goals. We set those goals for a reason. We need to meet them. And as you do so, address equity. She specifically called on DLCD to do work along these lines. in partnership with ODOT and others. So that order is what led to this rulemaking in part. Now, the positive thing, this isn't all gloom and doom. The positive thing is we're working to create great places that people love to visit and live in. Places like McMinnville's downtown, places you all are familiar with as well in your area. Just places people can meet their daily needs without having to get in a car, or can drive once and then meet various needs without getting in their car again. So places people can live and work and eat and shop and go to school and worship and all those things. So we're really looking to create more places like that. And this isn't where most people have to live, but the models show that if about a third of people live in places like this, we can get the numbers to work. So that's what we're trying to do. The rulemaking is focused on the 8 metropolitan areas where most Oregonians live and where most transportation pollution happens. You can see them on this map. They don't really impact places outside of those metro areas. And to be clear, the rules are applying to the urbanized areas in those MPOs. So it's the stuff inside the urban growth boundaries, sometimes within city limits and sometimes the county-owned area outside of that, such as in East Salem, for example. But Central Lane's right there as one of the 8. Next slide. As part of our process, we had a very large rulemaking advisory committee. Thank you for those of you here who are on it. I know Rob and Emma are here. We had representatives from those 8 areas. We also had people who we traditionally have not brought to the table. We realized that if we were going to really address equity, we needed to have the Rulemaking Advisory Committee represent the demographics of Oregon's overall. And so we have a lot more folks of color, a lot more people with disabilities, people representing people experiencing homelessness. On down the line, we worked to have a much more diverse Rulemaking Advisory Committee than we have in the past, and that's been hugely helpful. The group has developed an equitable outcome statement and advised us as we've gone. We've had 9 meetings. We have a couple more coming up. Next slide. The commission directed the department to take rulemaking in kind of 2 paths. The first is do regional plans that you all are familiar with to meet pollution reduction targets for your region. And the second is to just strengthen Oregon's basic land use and transportation rules in 6 areas, and they're listed and we'll go through them. I won't go through them here. Next slide. It's off to Cody.
Thanks, Evan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cody Myra, Transportation and Land Use Planner with DLCD, and just kind of want to talk through sorry about that. So here to talk about the Division 44 and the regional planning stuff. I'll just say that we had worked with some folks in the region prior to the rulemaking to get a pretty good commission scope and charge for the rulemaking, and that we really heard strongly from the region that the legislation required our region to do scenario planning and identify but not adopt a regional plan to meet the pollution reduction targets. We don't want to do that again. We want to implement and build off of that plan. So we heard that really loud and clear. So what we have done is put in the rules for Eugene Springfield is to allow you to take that plan that you've identified and come up with basically an implementation chapter. So how would the region implement that plan through their local plans? So that really just kind of puts you at that. We've done most of the work there, and I know that some of the jurisdictions have done a lot of work to pull that into their local plans already. So in Division 44, we have a work program. So tell us how you want to coordinate to do this work. What are the steps you think that would be necessary to do this work? Come up with that implementation and get it adopted into your local plans, and then go about making the local TSP amendments, comp plan amendments, the kind of things that you need to realize the actions in that plan. And then it kind of just goes over to a monitoring framework of every 4 or 5 years, just kind of tracking progress on where the region's at in meeting performance targets. So We have in Division 12 TPR identified performance measures and performance targets that are kind of the default. And your region would be able to come up with your own because you've done the scenario plan. So the actions that would kind of apply to you would be that you can use those performance measures we've identified. That's great. If you think there's better ones out there, you can suggest those, bring those in. That's consistent with what Metro did. They, here's our plan. Here's how we intend to reach our goals. And here's the things that we'll track over time to make progress and demonstrate progress towards meeting that goal. So that would be, I think, the big action for the region to take is just, how are we going to implement the climate scenario planning that we did back in 2015, and then what performance measures we want to measure success on, and then what are the targets we'll need to hit to do that. And this is kind of what that little yellow box would be, and that's kind of probably the primary work product for the region in this regard would be. Every 4 or 5 years, what are the gaps between the targets? What kind of corrective actions would be necessary? These are all moved over into the TPR now in the Rules 900. They've been taken out of Division 44 and put into Division 12. So it really, there's some other areas in the TPR where we're, have some more flexibility for folks that go through the scenario planning. But this would be the reporting cycle. So now we can pause here and see if there's any questions or comments, concerns on this section of the rules.
I can get started. Go ahead, Emma. You go first.
Go ahead. You can start.
No, you go first. Well, actually, first of all, I think when there's discussions like this, it's nice to just take down the presentation so we can see each other when we're talking. I'd like to encourage the LCD staff to do that in all meetings because we haven't been doing that in the breakout groups necessarily in the RAC meetings either. But go ahead, Emma.
I was going to start with a clarifying question just to get a little bit more info. I'm looking at the RAC 10 packet and I just opened it, so I haven't had a chance to digest it, but there is a checklist and I'm trying to understand the connection between the scenario planning and then the TSP updates. And if the scenario plan then feeds in, or if they're separate, how are they connected or separate? I guess it's a short question.
Yeah, it's a little unique for the Salem, Kaiser, Eugene, Springfield areas, but there is no deadlines yet for other regions to update their TSPs. But for the scenario planning regions, there is a deadline in Division 44, that applicability compliance section that says, when you should have a work plan, when you should, you can propose new dates. These are the default dates that we put in there to do the TSP amendments and local code amendments necessary to kind of actualize that scenario plan. So that kind of puts you on the clock to say, here's our scenario. We've got most of the things that we know we want to do. Here's how we're going to implement that. So what are the local plan changes that are going to be necessary to realize that? And as a part of that work plan, you could submit an alternative date and say, LCDC, this is, we think that that's a pretty good date, but we can do it sooner. We can do it a little later. So that would just kind of initiate that TSP amendment process for you.
So if we went with the default dates, that's really helpful, and I'm just trying to look at it in relation to the dates listed. If we went with defaults, my understanding is that the scenario planning would need to be submitted to LCDC for review and approval by December 31st, 2023. And then I'm seeing a new date saying when updating a TSP no later than December 31st, 2024. So that would be 1 year later. And so if we went with those default dates, would you be expecting the scenario planning outcomes to be integrated in that TSP amendment package that would be adopted 12 months after submitting to LCDC for review and adoption, which will take a few months from when we submit it to actually having it adopted? I'm just trying to understand that piece.
Yeah, I think for your region, it's just kind of, we have the scenario plan already. But we realized in talking with you through previous meetings, we've had a lot of coordination on this to say, what would that take to get that into adoptable form? Because when you kind of look at it, was pretty loose in some of its findings. It's like the region could do this or it could do that. It's like, okay, well, we're going to need something more specific. So I really just felt like we needed to say, let's add an implementation chapter to that plan and identify the performance metrics maybe. So yeah, I think that we could sort out those details, but I would expect that that scenario plan adoption in the TSP could just happen all in one process. And obviously, once we get into it, this is why we have that work plan, is we need to start thinking through it and to suggest a good order of events to happen. And we're more than willing to work with you to find out what's the best way to get all these things that can be implemented easily.
Great, thank you. It's helpful to hear that it could be simplified and be combined with one adoption package, because I'm trying to picture there's a lot of work and what are some logical kind of packages of adoption items to both do community engagement, but also to take to city councils and Lane County Board and whoever needs to adopt the different components, make sure that there's some logical packages that also don't overlap in weird ways that are confusing from a community engagement perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of like the phased approach on things like this that are that complicated, is to have milestones of maybe adoptable products or something that makes sense to the public and your electeds and the technical folks as well.
Yeah, I don't have any detailed comments. It's that sometimes with this whole process, I think these are all like great. These are the kinds of things we should be doing to reduce driving. Like, I don't question that at all. They're all the right kinds of things, but it's the enormity of how they're kind of layered upon each other and what that's going to mean for local planners. And I can tell you, I have a team of like 9 people, and like 95% of what we do is around active transportation and the kind of stuff we're talking about. But obviously, like, this stuff takes our time away from doing the implementation. And so it's just, I think it's just the enormity of how it's all layered upon. And I kind of wonder, like, there's elements of this that are going to require us to update our TSPs anyway to achieve the reductions in VMT. Why layer the scenario planning on top of that? Because if it's because you're required to do that by the governor or the legislature, I could see that you wouldn't have a choice. But other than that, we already coordinate at the regional level through our MPO. I don't necessarily see that there's a huge amount of added value to layering on these regional requirements on us when there's other, like I said, and if I'm wrong, that there's not other elements of this process that are going to require us to amend our TSPs to achieve these goals, let me know. For sure, point that out.
I'd just like to reiterate, we're really envisioning no modeling or really in-depth technical analysis from our end needed. We've looked at the plan and think that it's in 90% shape to get it adopted, and it's really just taking that next step. And really, you've asked your public, extensive outreach was done. $1 million is spent on developing that scenario. It really just kind of allows your region the extra flexibility to how do you want to define success, right? I mean, it's giving you a little bit more purchase on our local values of how you sorted through that as a region.
Okay. I've not read the revised ones that were sent in the packet, I think earlier this week, maybe, or last week, but did you dial back some of the requirements as part of Division 44? Because I think before there was like a climate friendly area requirement as part of that, in addition to the other CFA requirement, but was some of that pulled out of the scenario planning piece?
We just aligned it. So it says now,
Okay.
Just identify your CFAs that you're being required to do anyway. So it's like,
Okay.
show us your CFAs, because that was the intent the whole time, was to say, hey, we want you to have a 30% an idea of where those CFAs would be.
Okay.
Now that you've seen the full meal deal in the draft rules for the TPR, we're just asking in the regional plan to say, make sure you assume those when you're doing modeling. That really is, for your region, you're not doing the analysis for that regional planning. So it'd be pretty light there. I mean, most of the work is actually on coming up with the CFAs.
Okay. By the way, we really like that word identify rather than designate, just for future reference. So.
Other questions for Cody? All right, seeing none. I guess I'll continue on, so bear with me. as I share screens again. So yeah, so now we're going to talk about these 6 areas of planning rules, which are separate from the scenario planning piece. So climate friendly areas, reforming parking management, supporting electric vehicle charging, high quality pedestrian bicycle transit infrastructure, moving beyond a focus on motor vehicle congestion standards, and prioritizing and selecting projects that meet our climate and equity goals. So, I'll start by talking about climate-friendly areas, and I'll be speaking to the current draft. So the packet that just came out, there are no changes to the rules as they pertain to climate-friendly areas. Part of the reason for that is that we are starting to convene work groups, topic-specific work groups, as part of our rulemaking work. I think some of you are involved, have agreed to participate in those work groups. And so we will be refining some of these concepts as we move forward, but I'll be speaking again to the current draft of the rules. So yeah, what are climate friendly areas? We know what they are. They're walkable mixed use areas, areas that would allow for a variety of uses: residential, office, retail, services, public uses. As defined in the rule, and based on, I think, as Evan said, our goal is to get at least 30% of housing needs accommodated within climate-friendly areas over time. That is our goal. Our models show that if we do that, that will have a significant impact on reducing climate pollution. So there is a requirement to accommodate at least 30% of housing needs for cities with a population over 10,000. But I have to clarify, this is not 30% as determined through the HNA process. This is a different scenario where we're looking at a percentage of your theoretical building envelope in these climate-friendly areas. And there's specific language in the rules as to how to calculate, what that footprint would be like over time. So it's a little complicated, but it's an important detail. Also within climate-friendly areas, requirements for high-quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit services, a parking reform required in these areas. The current draft of the rules allows for abutting high-density residential or employment areas to also be included as climate-friendly areas, because they do support, even though they're maybe single-use zones, they support what we're trying to get to happen in those climate-friendly areas. And then lastly, local governments are able to choose between a prescriptive or an outcome-based standard. And this table kind of summarizes those standards within the existing rule. So they're based on the size of the local government, going from a 5,000 or above to cities over 100,000. And so the blue columns there are the prescriptive standards. We've scaled them back quite a bit from the first draft. So really, it's requirements for minimum residential densities and then maximum building height allowances. It's not a requirement to build buildings to this height. It's to allow buildings to be constructed to this height in a climate-friendly area. So a local government might adopt those development standards for their climate-friendly area, or they may feel we have a better package that's better positioned to meet our goals, and then they can pursue the outcome-oriented standard, where we essentially are setting a target. And again, this is scaled on size of city, but so for the smallest cities, 20 homes and jobs per net acre. And we'll be looking at the development standards, and basically the local government would need to demonstrate that yes, this package of development standards is able to result, would allow for achieving these targets. In terms of the timelines, we now have a phased timeline, and Rob, I hear your point. So I think identify climate-friendly areas by June 30, 2023 is the first threshold there. So that essentially is asking the local government to say, hey, these are the areas. This is the area or areas. You can designate multiple CFAs or maybe just one. These are the ones we're looking at, and including analysis of equitable housing outcomes. And our big concern there is the potential for displacing underserved populations that might currently reside in these areas. And if there is that potential, this asks local governments to identify mitigation measures that might be used to counteract that displacement. So that's an important component in that first step. The second step comes 1 year later with adoption of zoning and comp plan amendments, June 30, 2024. Also, as part of the zoning and comp plan amendment process, we have a different transportation review process. So this is different from the significant effect test in the current TPR. And essentially, instead of requiring that analysis, this review requires analysis of any gaps in the various transportation modes in climate-friendly areas, so pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and then planning to fill those gaps over time. Do note that in some cases, highway impact analysis is required in conjunction with CFA designation if you're in close proximity to an interchange, for example. And then lastly, there are amendments to the housing rule, to Division 8. First of all, that would require cities over a population of 10,000 to monitor and report on housing production in climate-friendly areas as part of that ongoing housing production strategy work. That's every 8 years in the Central Lane region. And so the reporting would be, how many housing units have we produced in our climate-friendly area or areas. Also requires reporting on affordable housing production in those areas. And also, of course, identifying strategies to facilitate the development of housing in those areas as part of that package. Lastly, we've amended the UGB component pretty significantly from the first draft. So per the current draft, essentially what the rules would require is that beginning June 30, 2027, UGB expansions that are based on residential needs would trigger additional climate-friendly area designation. And those areas would be sized to be enough to accommodate half of the additional residential need. And that is, that is not necessarily within the UGB expansion areas. This can be anywhere in the city, but it is kind of reinforcing that we are needing cities to grow more efficiently in the future, and sort of an incremental tool for moving us in that direction. So that's the overview. I have some time for questions and discussion, and I'll go ahead and stop share at this point if there are any questions. Molly?
I have a ton of questions, but I'm thinking most of them are detailed enough that would be more appropriate for Friday's conversation. But more generally, I'm wondering if you foresee that a lot of the climate-friendly areas will overlap with already existing nodes or already existing multimodal mixed-use areas. I presume yes. And in our community, at least, we've spent a lot of time planning in those areas, and there's a lot of planning fatigue. And so I'm really concerned about, going back to those areas, focusing our energy on those areas again, then we're ignoring the whole rest of our, city in that process, but then also effectively engaging citizens in those existing areas is a concern when they have this fatigue.
And I don't know that I can answer the question. I mean, our hope is that in many areas, the requirements for climate-friendly areas may be already met to a significant degree in existing downtowns or other nodes or multimodal mixed-use areas. That isn't necessarily always the case, and so we understand that some adjustments would need to be made. However, that outcome-based approach does provide the local government the opportunity to say, hey, we spent a lot of time developing our provisions, our development regulations for these zones. And here's how we believe they will achieve the targets in terms of residential and employment growth that you're needing to see. And if those are sufficient, I think you'd be good to go there. I can't promise that, you know, your existing provisions would get you there, but that outcomes-based approach would be an option for you.
Okay.
It looks like Deputy Director Green has something to add.
And thanks, Kevin. You can certainly call me Kirsten, but thanks for the formality. Good to see everybody. Thanks for letting me weigh in. Molly, I would just be curious. Thanks for just sharing, you know, about the fatigue and how much planning work you've done in those areas. And this is not a judgment call. We're all learning, but I just would be curious if you guys had the discussion too about risk of kind of public investment induced gentrification and displacement in those areas. We just know are learning more from experience in the last decade how much kind of as we increase transit, bike ridership and things that can have unintended effects. I didn't know how much the city of Eugene had kind of done that in your guys' conversations to date. And again, no judgment if not, but that'd be just a piece that I know we share a concern. It's not just DLCD's concern, it's sort of a statewide concern.
For sure. I mean, in Springfield, I would say, you know, a likely candidate for a climate-friendly area is Glenwood. And we have a lot of policies in place to address displacement. It's whether or not our, you know, local officials are willing to follow through on those policies. But we have
probably investments, huh, Molly? Because it's like, it's not just policy, but to offset gentrification, it's investments too, I suspect, but thank you. And I probably cut you off, Molly. Bad behavior. I was nipping at your heels there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Terry, you had a question or comment?
Thank you. First, I just want to say I'm coming at this super fresh. Rob and Heather and Jen Willer have been tracking this a lot more closely than I have. So certainly jump in if I say something inconsistent with what you all have been thinking. But what Molly said really resonated with me because on the Eugene side of I-5, we have a vision of compact development along all of our corridors. It is nowhere near being implemented in terms of the zoning that needs to get updated. We're in the middle. I wish we were further, but we're truly in the middle of planning for densification along River Road up to a new transit station with a big hope for MX investment in the near future. That's dependent on a bunch of policy decisions, but it is the vision and it is the neighborhood's hope to couple investment in BRT with upzoning for compact development. Like that's our vision. We've had it for over 20 years. But what Molly said is spot on. We've got a group that's been at it 4 years in River Road doing their plan. And this would undo it. It would redo it. Very different targets, very different goals. So that is a big concern to me, how we talk to them even. You've probably heard from them already. They've written letters probably while the rulemaking is going on. But that's a big concern. And then on your point, Kirsten, about gentrification and planning for that, it's a city-wide concern and an active recommendation of our housing implementation pipeline project in Eugene, but it hasn't started yet. And so we don't have, I would say we don't have a sense yet of kind of what our strategies are going to be that are supported by council, because that work will probably kick off next fiscal year. Those are some of my thoughts. I would love it if Heather or Rob could make me smarter about what you all have been chiming in with.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that last week we submitted a letter to DLCD staff, mostly, and Kevin, I think we sent it directly to you, mostly about the land use components or provisions of the packet 9. So of course it's already outdated, but so I don't want to really go into a lot of those comments, but you know, one of our primary concerns or questions is about the different outreach components that are necessary for each of the provisions. So everything's staggered by about a year, and then kind of leading up to the housing capacity analysis. And it's great that it's all integrated, but like Molly was saying, we definitely have concern that we'll be reaching out a bunch and that we're going to lose our audience, right? And so the more that we can dovetail, and I think we're getting closer, but the more that we can dovetail the outreach components. So because a lot of times I think the public is not, they want to know that we're coordinating transportation and land use for sure. And when we're coming to them with this rock and then this rock and then this rock with just a little bit different framing around it, it gets pretty confusing. And it gets difficult for us to articulate exactly how that this is different and why should you care when you just gave us your comments last year on this. So I think that's one of the big things is staff resources and public attention span for having all of these different components that require outreach and that are going to require public hearing processes, code amendments, those kinds of things. So the staggered approach is good, but it also means that we end up with multiple potentially overlapping efforts, I guess.
Thanks, Heather. And I've talked to Alyssa Hansen as well. Your region has done, you've done a lot of good work. You know, going back to Terry's comments on the River Road area, it sounds like what you're doing could fit within that CFA concept, but it may be that you're looking at a TOD that's really focused on high density residential without a mixed use component. And so, you know, I understand the challenges there. And that's kind of a call that you would make as you're kind of working through this is, man, does it make sense to designate a CFA there? It can achieve a lot of our goals, even if we're not going to call it a CFA. But I understand the issues you raised. Emma.
We have a question actually from our comprehensive planning manager, Sandy Belson, and she should be joining us later. If we look at the outcome-based approach, my understanding is that for Springfield size, we'd be looking at 40 jobs and 40 homes, and I'm trying to figure out per acre. So in a CFA, would that be 40 of either jobs or homes, or are you expecting a combination of 40 jobs plus 40 homes on every acre within a CFA? And if so, is there market research to say that the private development is actually going to be able to support that level of development, or are we accidentally saying this is a CFA, aka a no build zone?
Right. So that's a good question. It is both. We need to have both the housing and the jobs together to make this work in the way that it needs to. It is an aspirational goal. And really what we're talking about is setting the table for that development to occur. We understand that cities can't make this happen. We're hopeful that over time, the package of, you know, basically trying to reduce any obstacles to the development, and, you know, over time we'll start to see that mixture of uses. You know, we've looked at these provisions, these types of things that have been done in other cities. But let me be clear, the outcome-based standards are not setting a minimum floor. It's not a minimum density. It's not a minimum employment number. It's not saying you can't build here unless you achieve 20 dwelling units and 20 jobs per acre, or whatever the number is. It is basically saying the package of, you know, development standards will allow for this level of development. And there are some absolute, you know, if you take the prescriptive package, there are minimum density requirements that would apply. Those are a little bit lower, frankly, than the targets that we're shooting for, because it's a minimum. It's not the absolute total that we would expect to see. This is good. I know there's a lot of interest in this topic, but I want to make sure we get to the other rule areas as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker. And I can't remember who that is. If there's time at the end, though, we can come back to climate friendly areas. So
that's me. Okay. So parking reform. Before I get into this, I do want to thank both Emma and Rob specifically for improving the parking draft. It has evolved over the months and versions of the draft. So thank you for your improvements. It continues to evolve. Why parking? You all hopefully know this, but I try to highlight it because it is a politically difficult conversation. First, because it's a huge user of land, particularly in the places that we're trying to make walkable and like downtowns. It just consumes so much of our land. Next slide. Secondly, a lot of it is wasted. When we do parking utilization studies, when people do it in other states, we find a lot of spaces that are just overbuilt. Next slide. And it crowds out things we care about. This is an example of a site in Eugene that if it allowed less parking, they could build a quadplex, but because the code had currently required 1 per unit, they could only make a duplex pencil. So that may have changed since this example was put up, but it does do that generally. Next slide. Lastly, it increases driving. When we provide a bunch of stuff at no cost to the end user, people consume more of it than when you produce less of it, and there are some costs. So the academic literature kind of demonstrates that basic economic principle. And since we're trying to reduce driving is a core tenet of this rule, that's why we care parking is part of this. Next slide. So the draft parking rules kind of do 3 things. First, they bring in best practices from codes across Oregon of kind of how parking is counted and how parking might be provided off-site or shared or things like that. And it has communities implement all those practices in your code, a lot of which are probably already in Eugene and Springfield codes. Secondly, and this is kind of the core of it, is it requires communities to choose one of 3 approaches. The first is to deregulate parking, just repeal your parking mandates. And there are communities all over the world that have done this, done it for decades, or at least downtowns in places. I know Eugene's downtown, for example. Yeah, and just lets builders provide the diversity of parking for their own development. Let's builders figure out that nuances and those things. The second 2 approaches, or the latter 2 approaches, say, hey, we're going to find some key areas and key types of development. We're going to reduce regulations. Option 2 also has communities adopt 3 of 5 policies that we can't require folks to do generally, but they're really fairness policies where the people who aren't consuming parking don't pay for it. So unbundling, you rent your parking space separate from your unit, or flexible commute benefits. If employers are providing free parking, they provide a equivalent to people who aren't using that parking, that sort of thing. And the third option is just brings in larger areas of communities that parking mandates are reduced, and more types. The last thing is populous communities like Eugene do more parking management. You have the sophistication and the ability to do more parking management. So that's kind of the overview of the rules. These are the sorts of, when I say types and areas, talking about multifamily, draft rules say, hey, minimums can't be higher than 1 per unit for multifamily, and you can't require parking at all for micro units, affordable housing, treatment facilities, homes for people with disabilities, that sort of thing. And also around priority transit corridors. And in climate-friendly areas, the rules provide 2 options. One is no mandates, and the other is greatly reduced mandates plus a parking benefit district. Next slide. As noted, the most populous community is 100,000 plus. There's some parking maximums work. I haven't looked at Eugene's parking code lately, but you may have already done that. And ask folks to study where you're pricing on-street parking and adjust them at least every 3 years. The current draft now says metered. Previously, it also had permits, but so that's taking a little work off your plate. And then ask folks to try things before building parking garages, because we think AVs are going to be something in the future. Building parking garages is probably not a great strategy. Finally, it says, hey, if you want to keep mandating parking in your community, you have to price some of your current on-street spaces at least 5% by September 2023 and 10% by September 2025. And it can't be just, hey, here's a $15 annual permit. That's not really a price signal. It has to be at least 50 cents a day or $15 a month. So I know Eugene doesn't have those prices currently, but that's the sort of aim, is saying, hey, this parking has value. You're providing it. So because it has value, we're going to mandate more of it. So that's that. Next slide. Last thing in parking, electric vehicle charging. This would apply in places where there are more than 5 parking spaces. And it just says, hey, let's have development ready for the EV revolution that we're all planning on coming. We have aggressive goals. The country has aggressive goals. The state has aggressive goals for an EV future. And we want to make sure that development has the conduit to support that EV charging in the future. So there's some numbers there. It also says, hey, we have to have service capacity. We have to have some of the electrical stuff ready for 20% of spaces. And there's a retrofit requirement. There's a conformance requirement on major retrofit for cities over 50,000. So that's a high-level overview. Open to questions and comments, thoughts, further improvements. And we are having a parking reform group meet tomorrow morning at 9 to go through, I think 9 o'clock to go through all the details. So a couple of hours of digging in and tweaking things a little bit more.
Well, I appreciate the appreciation of our comments, and I want to say Michael Liebler and Christina Kraz are both listening in today, and they were really helpful from a Springfield perspective. They were on the project team for the TSP implementation project that took our adopted TSP policies and actually updated the development code. And parking, of course, is always a hot topic. So we did a deep dive, and that was just adopted beginning of 2020, so pretty recently. A couple questions on my mind, and I appreciate that Christina's here, is I'm still not sure with the revised rules, and I haven't looked at packet 10 for this detail. How are we ensuring that ADA spaces are continuing to be provided? And I know there were some provisions saying the spaces could be up to a certain number of feet off site. But on really large sites, I'm thinking, International Paper takes up a large landmass in the middle of Springfield. And if you say, okay, from the edge of their site, go another 100 feet, 200 feet, 1,000 feet, whatever it is, and someone in a wheelchair is trying to navigate to their front door, that's multiple half miles or mile plus. So what's happening with ADA? And then on the EV piece, what involvement from utilities has there been in the rulemaking? Because I mentioned it to our Springfield Utility Board, delivery. And they said that statewide utilities were in the dark. And we're like, wait, there's a rulemaking process? What's going on? Electric charging? What? And also setbacks and other things that they care about.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Communities can still require parking spaces for people with disabilities, so that none of this is impacted by that. Communities will take different approaches doing that. The city of Portland uses the building code, for example. So the building code would apply. So there's nothing preventing communities from doing that. I didn't want to build a parking table in there to mandate it across, but you can pretty much do what you're doing, maybe with some rewording currently. And the draft rules did adjust to, I think, a 200-foot to the nearest entrance if off-site. So on a big site, yeah, per your suggestion. So I talked with our disabilities consultant, Michael Sporluk, and he signed off on that. So that hopefully resolves that concern. But yeah, so certainly something we don't want to impact, and a community we do want to serve with that ability. So as far as the EVs and utilities, I have had meetings with various utilities. Jennifer Jolie has been working with her network of utilities. So I've met with some COUs and PGE and talked through this. I've kind of trusted their community to talk among themselves, but I understand maybe we haven't reached all utilities. They had reached out to us previously about some setback issues, and then they heard this was going on. So we've adjusted the EV charging in response to some of their input, but I certainly would encourage more conversations because it's not my area of expertise. So I've been working through that with our partners at ODOT and utilities and Forth and other folk, but happy to hear from other utilities as well. So hopefully that addressed that. But yes, change some language about amperage and stuff. And it's like, okay, Rob.
Actually, did anyone else want to ask questions or talk for parking? Because I know I've spoken a couple times already. Okay, I'll dive in then. So the issue, the one about pricing on-street parking, that, we have a lot of local streets in Eugene that are in single-family neighborhoods, and are we gonna have to go measure the frontage and like figure out how much on-street parking there is in all those neighborhoods? And what about unimproved streets? Some streets it's not really clear if you can park on it or not. It just seems like a rat hole. And I just wonder if there's other ways to get at this issue of pricing parking and encouraging jurisdictions to price parking. I mean, we do a lot of metering in Eugene. We have areas where it's residential permit parking, which aren't going to qualify for this because the price is too low in those areas. I'd almost rather see you guys like come up with strategies to help us better manage our residential permit parking areas so that the resources utilized better. Because what happens now is you'll have a residential permit parking area next to the university. Barely anyone can park on the street there because you can only park for an hour or two, which means that more off-street parking may get built in the area so that people who do drive have a place to park, which means we can't develop this compactly. So sometimes there's unintended consequences too to the strong residential permit parking zones. So just maybe think about that whole thing more. I'm not going to be in the parking work group tomorrow. We're very supportive in Eugene of requirements around residential permit parking. I don't know if Brian's still on the call. I don't see. Well, he is. I see Brian there. Just want to encourage ODOT to help partner more with local jurisdictions to actually pay for installing EV charging at in low-income neighborhoods, in the right-of-way, in places where people don't have the ability to charge because, say, their landlord doesn't provide EV charging in affordable housing developments. From what I can tell, of the $52 million that ODOT's going to be getting out of the new transportation bill is going to looks like it's all going to be focused on like highways or the West Coast EV highway, something like that. I'm sure I don't have the terminology quite right. So we would love to see some resource provided to cities too to help people get their EVs charged and build out, because as you're well aware, you're only able to require the conduit to be there, but we also need to figure out how to pay for the chargers themselves too. So hopefully Brian can pass that request on to some of his colleagues in the climate office. Thank you.
I will. Thanks for the comment, Rob.
Yeah, real quickly. So part of the EV parking stuff that was a learning process for me was why do we have a bunch in commercial? It's because there are those low-income folks who are living in residences that won't have the option to charge at home, because 90% of charging now is at home. And I was like, oh, we should just do homes, but retrofitting that is super expensive. So we're imagining that the charging at commercial will allow some folks to charge while they're at work or at the store or elsewhere. So that's the aim, is to meet some of those needs there. really building out the network there. And secondly, I imagine we'd have a significant flexibility as far as the precision of the percentages on your on-street parking costs. We have heard that concern that you don't actually know how much parking you have. And so my general is like, okay, why are we requiring more parking if we have have no idea what we have? But that's a little bit flip. I understand that. My experience is universities, this is a great project, and I've seen Portland State University folks try to study how many parking spaces are in Portland, and that level of detail would be sufficient. So we realize some clarity on the guidance, and that would be helpful as you decide whether to take that path or not. But yeah, we're not looking for every last number. We're looking for good faith estimates based on decent data and decent work. Sasha? Oh, and I know we're running out of time real quick.
Sorry, and just really quick to kind of echo some of Rob's questions. I'm transportation planning with Lane County, and we have the jurisdiction of many streets both within the urban growth boundaries of Eugene and Springfield. So just the more clarity that can be provided about parking requirements and what that would mean for the county and the streets we have jurisdiction over would be very helpful.
Yeah, in short, these would apply to those areas, but I can follow up with you outside of this as well. Yeah, you're required to adopt things the same way cities are for those areas inside UGBs. Kevin?
All right, thanks, Evan. We'll go ahead and turn things over to Bill to take us through some of the transportation planning rules.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming today. My name is Bill Holmstrom. I'm the agency's Land Use and Transportation Planning Coordinator. I'll be talking a little bit about transportation planning, transportation system planning, and how we plan to make some shifts there. We have had the transportation planning rules, which require coordinated land use and transportation planning for about 30 years here in Oregon. So this is not necessarily new work, and it's probably not new to anyone that's on this call. We've required this coordinated planning for a long time, for decades. So we're better off in Oregon than we would have been if we didn't have this work. But we know from what Evan told us earlier in the presentation that we still have work to do. We are not meeting our climate goals. We're not meeting our equity goals. So we need to make some changes, need to make some shifts. But we want to build on what we've already done, where we've been successful so far. And so we're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but basically turn the volume up on what we've done before. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of different pieces to this that I think are important to understand. And one of them is making sure that we're prioritizing planning for our pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation networks. And when I talk about our pedestrian network, I'm talking about facilities for people that are walking, but also facilities for people that are using mobility devices. When I talk about a bicycle network, I'm not just talking about bicycles, I'm talking about e-bikes, scooters, other types of mobility devices, maybe even skateboards, especially electric skateboards, things like that, that kind of operate at that same kind of scale and speed that a bicycle does. Sometimes we say bicycle, that kind of turns people off, but we're talking about a kind of a wide range of devices and vehicles there. And public transportation, which is super important. Of course, that's the transportation within our communities, but also between them. And we're looking to build connected, safe, and complete networks. We've done a good job in the last half century of building a connected, complete network for being able to drive to get from A to B and get pretty much wherever you need to go. Obviously, we need to continue to plan for our street networks. There'll be places where there are gaps. There'll be places where we need to be able to connect to new development. That's fine. But about a third of Oregonians can't drive. They aren't old enough. Maybe they're too old. Maybe they have a disability. They just don't have the financial ability to be able to own and operate a car. It takes a lot to be able to do that. So we want to make sure that we're giving that opportunity for everybody to be able to get around a variety of different ways, be able to reach their destinations safely. We're prioritizing in particular climate-friendly areas to make sure those places are where it's very easy for people to be able to meet their daily needs without having to drive a car. We want to focus on neighborhoods with underserved populations. These are often neighborhoods that have had a legacy of disinvestment or malinvestment, where we need to make sure that we're very careful about the investments we're making in those places to be sure that they're helping folks and that they're getting that they're not being left behind. And of course, to access key destinations, because we want to make sure people are getting to the places they need to get to meet their daily needs, whether it's getting to school, to work, shopping, medical appointments, anything you can think of. We need to make sure that people are connected to those. Next slide, please. So a couple other pieces. One of those is basically how we select projects in our local transportation system plans. We have a variety of prioritization factors that we have laid out in the rules. We expect local jurisdictions to develop a prioritization scheme in close coordination with underserved communities in their in the city, in the communities, to make sure that it's meeting the needs of a wide range of people, that other voices are being heard that haven't traditionally been heard in the transportation planning process. And then when the projects are prioritized, they're put together in an illustrative list, and that illustrative project list of the whole list of projects that might happen work together to meet the climate goals for that community, the VMT reduction goals. Then there would be a smaller financially constrained list of the projects that the jurisdiction expects to be able to fund over the planning period. And then that list would result in a VMT reduction. Doesn't have to meet the goal, because that would be difficult to do in a financially constrained plan. The other piece that we're talking about is measuring success in our transportation system. Right now, for many reasons, or for many applications, jurisdictions use probably a level of service or a V over C ratio, basically ways of measuring how many vehicles can get through an intersection during the peak hour. That's one way of measuring success in a transportation system, but it's only one way of measuring success, and it doesn't measure all of our values. It doesn't measure other ways of getting around, whether that's walking or biking or taking transit. It doesn't measure whether or not people are successfully able to connect to the places they're trying to get to and can access those places. It doesn't measure safety. So we are requiring local governments to adopt at least 2 transportation system performance standards for every part of their system, and that at least one of those standards can't be just motor vehicle congestion based. So I think we still have a little bit of work to do, and that'll be the subject of one of our work groups here in the next week or so. But those are the 3 kind of big thrusts that I was talking about here today. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and close the slide here, and I'm happy to take any questions about that piece of it. I've been taking notes here. I'm not sure if someone else is able to take notes while I'm trying to answer questions here. Thank you. And maybe I should say we have basically kind of 3 work groups that we have coming up the next week or so about different parts of this. One of them having to do, like I said, with transportation performance standards. One having to do with transportation system plans in general, and how transportation system plans are put together and how those are operationalized. And then one having to do with the modal planning, the specifics of the pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and street planning.
I'll just make a comment. We received a TGM, or for those of you that aren't familiar, a Transportation and Growth Management grant to develop both transportation demand management regulations, and as part of the same process to reform our traffic impact analysis rules in Eugene. And we found we kind of bit off more than we felt like we could chew, and so we set the TIA part aside. So basically, like, how do we write? Currently the way we do TIAs in Eugene is pretty much the old school way, that you're basically looking at vehicle trips and how to mitigate those. And we have very few tools to require any kinds of pedestrian or safety improvements as part of development projects. And even though we're one of the larger cities in the state, we had trouble setting the staff resource aside to kind of really take a deep dive into that. So if there were any resource in the future that DLCD could provide to help local governments figure out how to do a better, how to shift their TIA and just the transportation element of development review more towards what this overall process is looking at, I think we would really, appreciate that. And I think part of the challenge too is just understanding like what can we do under Oregon law, what can we require of developers. And so like I think if DLCD were to put out some sort of model code on it or something like that that we could feel comfortable adopting, I think that would also create a lot more comfort for the city.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rob. And you're not alone. I know the city of Portland actually did they're the biggest city in the state. They did a big project on this of whether or not they could, have impact fees that to try to complete the gaps in the sidewalk networks in particular. And they ran into some really big issues and questions about how they could actually operationalize that and make that work. So I think there's a lot still. We're kind of on the bleeding edge here. There's not a lot in the rule about development review in the draft rule. When we talk about the performance measures or standards, it's mostly having to do around kind of the 060 side of things. So the land use changes and not so much the TIA stuff, which are all implemented locally. And there's nothing in the TPR that says you have to do that. So yeah, I think that's an area that needs more study, and absolutely, I think willing to help do that. That I'm not necessarily going to be. I can't promise that as part of the immediate rollout of the rules and implementation, but I agree with you.
Michael?
Yeah, in terms of your performance standards, I'm wondering qualitative, quantitative. Is one of those going to need? Is it going to need to be quantitative, or can it be qualitative?
We don't prescribe that in the rule. We're actually leaving it quite open about what that is. Metro's doing a lot of work right now and trying to figure out what some other measures might be. I think, for better or for worse, with 060 in particular and those reviews, there's a lot of existing case law around that. And I don't know. This is a place where maybe we need to talk with some attorneys. It may be that the qualitative having a number would be better legally, but that's not something I think the TPR how it was designed in the first place and how we're conceiving it now is something that we're requiring. If that makes sense. I don't know. Matt, did you have any thoughts about that maybe?
Well, I think the challenge in the 060 arena is that it does need to be probably, I'm going to use the phrase clear and objective. It's got to be something where you come to a yes or no decision. But I could imagine that you could design a qualitative that got you to that yes, no decision without a lot of numbers involved. Yes, it's here. Yes, there is a crosswalk, or no, there isn't a crosswalk, or something like that. Or it wouldn't necessarily be quantitative. But I'd have to think about it some more.
A little follow-up question. And I am obviously, just to respond to the last one, I am definitely not a lawyer, and I definitely think we need the legal to clear in that, especially with the clear and objective. Because it's not jiving with what I've been hearing legally, especially with needed housing. The other thing I wanted to do in terms of your performance measures, when you mention accessibility, are you specifically meaning ADA accessibility? And isn't that already a mandate and a requirement in terms of our ADA laws? And is that really something that even needs to be in there as a performance standard, since it should be an outright expectation?
Yeah, we're not trying to duplicate any standards so that are already required under ADA or anything like that. And I think accessibility, it can be taken a couple of different ways. And part of the problem is that we're being very, very loose in this particular rule and open and letting people choose kind of lots of different ways. And we've had people ask us, can you be more specific? Can you give us a safe harbor? Can you do that? And we're not, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the work group, I think. Accessibility can mean accessibility for people with disabilities. It can also mean being able to access services or sites, and maybe we need to be clear about what that means, but we're not trying to duplicate any ADA standards anywhere, if that's what the question is.
Emma.
Thanks. So I know that I think it was Commissioner Lelag asked a really great question about the system development charges that have already been collected for projects that are in our TSPs, but with the revised transportation system planning rules, that would change quite a bit of how we do our TSPs and could have some existing adopted projects no longer be able to be adopted in our updated TSP. So is there any follow-up or response on that piece?
Yeah, thank you. So it's on our list to talk with the Department of Justice about that, along with some other funding methodologies and bonds, things like that, where there's maybe some things that are already kind of set in place and we don't necessarily want to come back and upset the apple cart. I want to be clear, we're not saying there's any project that anyone can't do right in the future. There may be different hurdles, or different, I should say hurdles, I should say, different standards for how those projects are approved. And then I think the big one, of course, is trying to meet the VMD reduction targets within the project lists. Of course, trying to fit, if you're doing a project that may increase VMT quite a bit, then you have to balance that. And that might be difficult. But I do want to be clear, we're not saying there's any project that's anywhere that you can't do. We're not saying, no, don't do this or that, the other thing. We're trying to be flexible. We're trying to allow, try to point us in the right direction, do good things, make it easy to do the right thing, but not making it impossible to do anything else either. So be clear about that.
With the do the right thing, I know that there are a lot of disparities in people involved in pedestrian crashes and crashes more broadly across our state. So I'm thinking about the Main Street Safety Project in Springfield and how the proposed new rules as a RAC Packet 9, I haven't looked at RAC Packet 10, so maybe it's changed and I'd love to hear. There was a piece about adding capacity, and you could say that converting a current signalized intersection to a roundabout intersection adds capacity, but we're primarily doing it for the safety benefits on one of the highest crash corridors in the state. So have there been any adjustments to that capacity and additional work needed in those types of projects?
So we haven't made changes. Yeah, no, I hear that comment, and I remember your comment from the last advisory committee meeting. We haven't made a change to that piece in this time, but I think we're open to having that discussion. That's something we'll talk about if we can get to it in our modal discussion. Maybe that bicycle people talk about a lot of stuff and bicycle stuff at that meeting, but we'll see. But that's slated. It's something we can talk about. I think, we are open to thinking about what the threshold for doing that process should be different, or we should make adjustments to that so we're not catching too many things like that you're talking about in those type of projects that need that additional review. But we're not planning to get rid of that review process, if that's what you're asking.
Okay, yeah, connectivity is really important, as your slide noted, and when you're looking at the rule, it's one thing, but looking at physical reality, there's a lot of places where building as part of a project would be great to have a detour route that builds a new little collector or local street and makes a connection, which helps for evacuation, a number of different things that relate to climate, but maybe adding capacity. So I don't want to accidentally trigger something that's like don't go there, or it requires so much more additional analysis to achieve some of the safety or climate resilience goals that we have.
Yeah, I think we're happy to have that discussion about thresholds, and I all the examples you've given are ones that make sense. And every time we go out there, and we always do things that we need to adjust, and I think that's something we can look at. Yeah.
Can I ask Emma a clarifying question on that? I heard this example, and I'm trying to understand how a roundabout would add capacity to an intersection. I happen to live right next to one that got installed, and the lanes are the exact same, and I'm not, unless you're having like
I'd like to defer that question to him.
That is an easy question for a transportation engineer to answer.
Awesome.
The simple answer is that roundabouts are superior in handling capacity to traffic signals across the board.
But we're talking about throughput and not adding lane capacity, though. Is that
yes, throughput? And often you can reduce lanes and still have the same or even more capacity. The roundabouts are unbelievably efficient and provide multiple benefits both greenhouse and that. So increasing capacity for them decreases delay, decreases dwell, it decreases all the greenhouse gases that you're looking for while still giving you the throughput and enhanced throughput.
Okay, it sounds like we define it as like lane capacity and not like overall throughput.
Well, I think our
capacity.
rule maybe needs some clarification about that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
we'll work on that. Yeah.
I just like to follow up on one thing with Emma's too, and thank you very much, Emma, for mentioning the alternate corridor, is that when we talk about utilities, those utilities often take advantage of alternate corridors and follow transportation facilities. So don't shoot yourself in the foot when you need excess capacity of utilities by looking at a capacity. The capacity also in the roadway relates to capacity of utilities and infrastructure other than just vehicle travel. So especially on Main Street where we're trying to move utilities or have the ability to move utilities off of the only backbound road, having an alternative corridor for the utility would allow us to up our power and capacity as well, while improving the level of service and the level of stress for bike and ped in there. So don't shoot down our alternative corridor things and other transportation facilities thinking that they're only always focused on vehicles. Thank you.
All right, are there any other questions on the transportation planning rules? Okay, seeing none. So here's what I propose. We've got a bit of time left. I'd like to run through just the last few slides to just tell you about input opportunities and such. If there are people who want to stay on and have more questions or comments on any of the topic areas we've already covered, I think we're happy to do that. But let me go ahead and give you a little more information on where we are. So let's see. This is the last slide we saw. So this is our upcoming rulemaking schedule. It doesn't have all the work group meetings that we've talked about, but it's really looking at the upcoming meetings of our RAC, our Rulemaking Advisory Committee, and the Land Conservation and Development Commission. So our next scheduled meeting for the RAC, for the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, is December 17. We've just released the packet on that. We do have a complete set of rules in that packet. So anybody who's interested in the current state of affairs in terms of the proposed rules can go to the packet and find that information, including updated scenario planning rules, Division 44. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be having reports out from all of the work group conversations that we're going to be having over the next week or so. And then in January of 2022, it's actually on January 20th, we have scheduled that meeting. We believe the last RAC meeting will be looking at the final set of rules, commenting on refinements, any refinements needed to that last set of rules, and also reviewing the required impact statements that are associated with the rules. From there, we then go to the commission, Land Conservation and Development Commission. And with them, we'll provide an overview of the draft rules, impact statements, and also if there are any lingering policy questions, that'll be an opportunity to kind of get a sense from the commission about where they stand on some of those issues. Once we have that input, we will be developing that final package of rules and set that up so that we're ready for our first public hearing, either on March 31st or April 1st with the commission. And then the final adoption of rules, May 19th or 20th. So that's our schedule moving forward. There are a number of opportunities for input from this point forward. So first of all, I'll be sending out a post-meeting survey to participants, and please fill that out. That will give us some helpful information as we're continuing to work on the rules. Obviously, you can reach out to staff at any time. Our contact information is available on our website. You can submit written testimony to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And then there will be input opportunities for the commission. first of all at the February 3rd meeting, but then starting the hearing process in March and up to the final adoption hearing in May. So that is the schedule. And at this point, I'll stop sharing. And if people have more questions, I think we're happy to entertain them or comments. All right.
I'd love to hear some more questions from those of us who are, people who are not on the RAC. You know, Rob and I have spent quite a bit of time on this, and it's really great to have our colleagues around the table also thinking about, okay, well, what would this look like from our perspective?
And we really appreciate it too. It's very helpful to think about implementation and how this is, you know, how we might roll it out in the different regions. Looks like Michael has a comment or a question.
Yeah, so just to kind of give you a little background, I do development review for the city of Springfield. So I'm deep in the guts of working with developers and subdivisions and all kinds of things like that. And so really the parking is very interesting. And I understand, and I'm a cheerleader for you this process and moving forward towards where we need to. I think that we are, you know, we we have way too much parking for what we actually need. And I agree with that. I'm just wondering about the resources and cities' abilities to manage these programs and how these things are going to be laid out and how these cities are going to be able to absorb that with the resources that they have. You know, we have a difficult time enough in our downtown district being able to fund with the rates that are acceptable for the downtown parking programs to keep the employees running, to manage that program and do the parking enforcement. And so expanding that to citywide, where it's very hesitant to do permit parking or other residential parking, is what's the expectation and the plan for the cities to ramp up their employment and their programs? Are you assuming that this is going to be private, or are you assuming these are going to be public, you know, programs, and how do you see that rolling out?
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, we do definitely want to develop some guidance and some examples from around Oregon and other communities. We certainly are aware that a lot of Oregon communities' parking programs are self-funding, based on both the permits and the fees, the tickets. That's been our impression from conversations with people, obviously in Portland, but you know, also in La Grande and from what I hear, Corvallis and other places. So each community is unique, but the joy of parking policies is they do have some revenue streams built into them. You know, I have heard that concern. Emma's raised it, and I am aware that Springfield may be an outlier in that place. So hope to survey some cities and find some examples on how people are doing that via existing staff, shared staff doing other things, complaint driven. It really varies from community to community. Some just put up signs and that works enough. That's enough of an edge to get the tourists to move or not park places. But Springfield's a larger city than that, so I understand you may be in a tough spot there. So I've heard that desire, and certainly hope to develop some publications on how different communities are finding ways to fund the parking management that the rule imagines. But yeah, the 5% and 10%, well, it doesn't apply to Springfield, so I won't talk to that.
Molly.
Our comprehensive planning manager, Sandy Belson, couldn't attend today, but she had several questions, one of which, and again, this would apply in the Glenwood area of Springfield. Her reading of the climate friendly areas is that they cannot be designated outside city limits. And I just wanted to confirm if that's the case.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I just thought about this recently yeah, and that is true. And practically the reason why that is because we're requiring local governments to zone those areas. And obviously you can't zone an area that's outside city limits. The reason for it is, of course, that we need to see this development in the near term. We need to see it happening on a realistic time frame. What we wouldn't want to see is a local government designating a CFA in an area within the UGB, but outside city limits where development isn't likely to occur in the next, in the near term.
So sometimes
yeah,
outside the city limits happens to be in the core of our metropolitan area. So there may be some one-off circumstances that we may want to be thinking about.
I guess I want to understand that a little better. What's the impediment to annexing that area?
Well, the city doesn't force annexation, and so it's upon the property owners or, current property owners to initiate annexation. And so, yeah.
It also has to be adjacent per ORS. And so that really traps people who want to annex if they're not immediately adjacent to city limits. This is a huge problem in the River Road area.
River Road, yeah, I could see that. Okay, well, that's a wrinkle. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about. Assuming infrastructure's there and you've got a willing property owner. Okay, that's, yeah, I mean, I'd been thinking about greenfield areas, but there are some anomalies out there.
Would the county allow the development to occur, or would the county say annex before you can actually do this kind of development?
The annexation would be required prior to development, but at the time of identifying the climate friendly area, it may not be.
Right. Does the city's comp plan cover that area through like co-adoption with the county?
Yeah.
Well, it starts to sound like maybe it could be. I don't know.
Yeah, or maybe we have a threshold that says it's got to be annexable. Services available, some proximate, that kind of thing. I don't know, but anyway, I'm just thinking out loud at this point.
One of the questions there is sewer, because we do have some areas that are pretty central to the city that are will be able to be annexed, in the shorter term with a sewer extension, but maybe as of the date that we're designating those areas, they don't have that proximity to a sewer service, but other facilities are in place because we have a lot of areas where there's a lot of septic, and so the sewer main hasn't been extended down that street, but it's just a matter of time until somebody has a septic failure and needs that extension. So we think we just have to be thoughtful about what does that mean where we have these urban sort of unannexed islands.
Kevin, what's the horizon year that we're calculating all of this, percentage in?
According to the STS, the statewide transportation strategy, we're wanting to achieve 30% of housing in climate-friendly areas by 2035.
And would the city and the county make the case that this area could be developed by 2035? It's going to be part of that. It's in the plan for development by then?
Well, we made findings that it would be when we adopted our UGB. It's 2032 for Eugene, but yes.
Oh, that sounds promising.
This is why it's good to talk to y'all. Other questions, comments?
No one else has a question. I'll just ask more of Sandy's questions. She was asking about how mixed use is defined, and she found it confusing in 032 subsection 2.
Yeah, it's pretty, pretty general, mixed uses. Okay. So I think we say, residential, service, office. I can't remember. It's intentionally open. What we didn't want to do is a prescriptive kind of here's permitted uses, within these zones, because inevitably we'd not think of something or it would conflict with a local code. So we're allowing some flexibility for local governments to define those things, but it's got to meet the straight face test. Is this the mix, basically the package of mixed uses that we're looking to see in climate friendly areas?
Okay.
I'm wondering if any Eugene staff want to comment on looking into the data availability. I know Sandy's been communicating a bit with LCOG and our GIS staff to try to define what data do we even have access to when thinking about implementation of the rules. So if anyone would like to kind of share a recent update on what we're finding as to what data exists, what number we could actually crunch to inform the CFA planning work. Be curious about that.
Yeah, well, we did, so we're lucky in a sense that LCOG, we've been working with LCOG on the urban sim model to be the land use modeling component to be the partner of the transportation modeling component. And we asked them to give us an estimate of how much it would take to revise that model in order to do the climate friendly area capacity estimate for the downtown West University, Franklin Boulevard, kind of a mega potential climate friendly area. And so we were thinking, we have this model that is already has built into it things like setbacks and some of the prescriptive development standards that are in the draft CFA methodology, capacity methodology. And it was going to cost us about $3,000 to just update that model and do it for just that area. There would be some time savings with the fact that we did it for that area that you could apply to the rest of the city for whenever this goes forward. But that in itself was helpful to understand that even with the model that presumably incorporates all of those development standards to help you get at a building envelope, it actually would have to be revised to do the capacity methodology that's in the draft OERs. So we did not move forward with that, given that there's some work sessions or working groups, and some of those details could change. But I think that, like I said, I think that was helpful in knowing that even something that's so prescriptive, actually, we would have to change it. And the model itself doesn't try to give you a maximum building envelope. It actually tries to give you a realistic amount of capacity based on the building envelope. So that's one of the challenges we were running up against. And so I don't know about jurisdictions that don't even have that model to begin with, but that is the latest on trying to suss that out a little bit more.
Could you repeat the dollar amount that you quoted?
Yeah, it was about 3,000.
Thanks.
So I was curious, this is LCOG. Does their model doesn't cover Springfield, doesn't cover Coburg? It's really
It's a regional, it's a regional model.
Oh, it does. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's one way of approaching it, through inquiring with our GIS staff. I think that we can try to get at some of the numbers for jobs and residential units, but when we start looking at mixed use, it starts getting very vague and we don't have the data that's needed. So I think Sandy's overall point is trying to figure out, it's very data heavy, and if we're going to do more analysis and data involved work, is that the right data? Is it worth that extra work? Or can we achieve the outcomes that are desired from this rulemaking in simpler terms that aren't as kind of work intensive?
That's a good question. I think that once the rules are adopted, we're here to work with you. And I think if you have, a proposed approach, especially this region, because you're first up, on the scenario planning piece. I think we're very happy to roll up our sleeves and work with you to try to figure out what's the best path forward.
I'll just note as the part of that support is we're updating the place types tool, which has definitions of misuse, not to say that it'll be one-to-one, but that'll be coming out early next year. And so that could be used as just one piece of the jigsaw puzzle to help kind of look at like, where are things now and where might there be different opportunities to do different styles of code amendment to get to those kind of outcomes. So we're planning on having some kind of opportunity analysis associated with that tool going forward. And obviously it's nothing's ever perfect here. It's not gonna be a one-to-one to do that, but it could just be informative to help you if you so want to use that.
I also see that Sandy's joined us, as well as Amber Bell from Lane County. Welcome. Sandy, we've been asking questions on your behalf, but since you're here, if you have any additional, please chime in.
Well, not knowing what has been covered yet, I'll just keep listening.
Okay, fair enough. I should also note Patrick Wingard, our regional rep, is with us as well. So thanks, Patrick, for joining us. Any other questions or comments?
We didn't cover number 3 and number 4, Sandy. So if you'd like to ask those, you can.
All right, let me find that email. But it looks like Heather's maybe got something in the meantime.
Go ahead.
I need some time, Sandy. So just real quick, we mentioned this in the letter, but I feel like I have to say it anyway, is just as far as the timing goes and the deadlines, anything that requires code amendments, comprehensive plan, designation changes, adoption of anything is going to be a minimum of 6 months of a process, if not more. And so we put in our comments that any of those things like the parking requirements, the EV requirements, I think right now the schedule only allows for 7 or so months from when the rules are actually adopted to do that analysis, do whatever public outreach is required, and then also go through the formal adoption process. And so we would advocate for something more along the lines of 18 months from when the rules are adopted. And that would be more in alignment with what we have been going through with the middle housing. I think Terry's nodding. I think it was about 18 months is what we have been allotted for the deadline to adopt the code and do the outreach and the analysis from when the rules were adopted. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. And then also just on the lines of the prescriptive components, different prescriptive components, anywhere that there is the ability to, have the prescriptive component and then also have an allowance for an alternate method, like we were just talking about with the CFA capacity methodology, we would advocate for that.
All right, thank you. Sandy?
Sure, so I guess my question is related to the climate friendly areas. And so when I'm looking at section 0315, item number 2, and this is where you can calculate your capacity of the climate friendly areas. There's a statement that local governments may assume that residential dwellings will occupy 30% of the full buildable square footage within climate friendly areas. That percentage seems really low to me, given that I would think most climate friendly areas would have more residential than other types of land uses, commercial, office, retail. So where is that 30% coming from?
It's a ballpark number. I be perfectly honest with you, it's accounting for the fact that first of all, not every site is going to build to its full capacity, the full building envelope. So there's that factor. There's the mixed use component of the building. So how much is going to be employment uses or other uses? How much is going to be taken up by other needs on the building, other site requirements, setbacks, et cetera, et cetera.
But doesn't your buildable, I mean, your buildable square footage already removes the setback areas?
No, you're right. You're right. No, that's true. That's true. So no, it's really those first two factors that are why we're looking at 30%. Is that the right number? If there's data that can be provided that shows that, hey, on average, these are going to wind up being more of a 60-40 split or something else, that would be helpful. That would inform this number, to be frank.
At this point, I don't have data, but just it seems like 30% is too low. It seems like it should be over 50%, that you're going to have more residential than other types of uses. But anyway, we can.
Sure.
I mean, I think that would be helpful to look at what are existing mixes of areas that you're looking to have us replicate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I hesitate to bring in City of Portland because we know they're kind of an outlier in terms of mixed use development. Yeah, and that's a good suggestion. With if we had enough time to do that research, I think it would be very helpful. In the interim, if people are aware of sources, local examples of that, I frankly would be very welcoming of the data.
And then I guess my other question, if nobody else has one, and this is a technical question. So in 0351, it states that we are looking at the projections of all housing units within the planning period, but then 0354A has an or. So based on existing or anticipated land use requirements in those areas. So I'm just wondering which it is.
Boy, I don't have the rules in front of me right now, Sandy. We might want to take this conversation offline so I can have a chance to take a look at it, and I can get back to you on that question. So that's 035.
I think the question is, are we looking at accommodating all the housing units within the climate friendly, the 30% in climate friendly areas, are on our planning horizon or the existing housing?
Okay.
So,
I see.
And how it's worded, then what you're trying to do is going to affect how the wording is.
Okay, so essentially everything pivots off of the housing capacity analysis, the most recent adopted acknowledged HCA or HNA that you have, which identifies the overall housing need for the community. It's that number, and that would include, typically that's a 20-year horizon. So that's what we're planning for. 30% of those units, how much CFA zoning are we going to need to reach that goal based on those numbers? But if the language is unclear, I need to.
Yeah, I can follow up with that minor point with you.
Yeah. But again, it's a difference between, the thing with the housing HNAs is you have to look at past production trends within the zones and then extrapolate those forward, right? So if you're getting 15 units per acre in your medium density residential zone, that's what you have to assume moving into the future. With climate friendly areas, we're looking at theoretical building envelopes. So it's the goal of moving towards more intensive development in the future, but it's not linked to the prior production. And that's what we're trying to navigate here, is the difference between how we plan for our land needs currently, and that won't change, but then our aspirational goals for the types of development we need to see in these climate friendly areas in the future.
And maybe you covered this, but the timing of, if we have a housing needs analysis, are we required to update that as part of this, or are we, no?
No, if you've got an adopted, acknowledged H&A, you can use that data. You know, you'd want to look at your update schedule if you've got one, you know, coming based on the HB 2003 requirements, and you probably want to base it on the new one. But no, there's no additional requirement to update your H&A.
So, I mean, it seems to me like you would, I mean, it's a challenge because we all have this H&A schedule that's been adopted. Right. Eugene and Springfield are on different years. So for the regional scenario planning, you know, that's a kind of we're out of sync there. But then to have, I mean, the climate friendly just happen at one time when everybody else is on these different schedules, it just is challenging. And I don't know how you're going to thread that unless you can sync them up to be the climate friendly, also going in sync with the housing capacity analyses.
It is challenging.
But the cities are on different schedules within those. So I don't.
Sure.
So one thing we're considering, and we're throwing out there, it's in the cover memo of the packet, but there's no draft rules on it or anything, is we're interested in hearing from folks about providing some more flexibility for all the different kinds of dates that are coming up as part of the Division 12 work. And, you know, kind of like Division 44, where we've set out some dates, but also allow local governments to provide an alternate work program, doing something similar in Division 12. I think we, you know, the devil's going to be in the details on that. We want to make sure that we're making sure things are happening quickly, that there's urgency. And, you know, that's something our commission has made to us very clear, is that they want urgency. So, but I think, you know, what I hear a lot from this region and other regions is that there's a lot of different stuff that's happening, and this on top of it with some random seeming, you know, timelines on top of it makes it difficult to put that all together. And we, you know, might be reinventing the wheel sometimes, which I hate, you know, duplicating stuff. So to the extent we can provide some flexibility to local jurisdictions, we're going to try to see if we can do that. But again, we have a range of stakeholders also talking to us, including our own commission, which are urging to have all this done yesterday. So.
I guess I would just add on that, you know, I think Eugene has one of the furthest out housing capacity analysis deadlines. Ours isn't due until December 2026. And we already are like, oh my gosh, we need to start this immediately, just because the amount of time that it takes. And that was before this work was going on. So we totally understand hearing from multiple constituents, and just to give you a little bit more of that background as far as our concerns on that, because I think, yeah, that I, for one, without knowing any further, that sounds like that would be a helpful option to be able to propose a different timeline that we can identify that dovetails well with our housing capacity analysis.
At the risk of piling on, I just have to follow with one little comment, just to get the reality of working in a jurisdiction with too much to do. So I'm currently managing our House Bill 2001 code amendments and doing my job as a principal planner. I hope when I'm done adopting middle housing code amendments that I won't have to manage another code amendment process while still trying to manage my team. But that's the reality that where I think a lot of jurisdictions are in right now.
This sounds like a topic that might be good to have, you know, Eugene Springfield huddle on. I had submitted our proposed revised timeline with the last rule comments following RAC meeting number 9. And I just got the checklist on page 27 of this next packet. And I'm not sure to what extent it looks like maybe some things changed, but we need to kind of take that back to the drawing board and say, okay, is this fitting with what makes sense for our region? Or do we need some more amendments? Or maybe it's the more flexible work program, because it's not for the CFA and the housing capacity analysis, trying to link those all up, and with Springfield's comprehensive plan map. there's a logical sequence that I've talked through with Sandy and have provided revised dates. And it's not extending the timelines a lot further, but it's syncing it up so that it works in a logical fashion. So I really appreciate what you're saying about the flexibility and having that option to have a work program that can talk with Eugene and figure out what works for us and figure out something that makes sense, especially back to Molly's point that I just want to reiterate from the beginning of the meeting around community engagement. We want this to be a process where we're rewarding and encouraging more community engagement now through years to come, and not further fatiguing and kind of disengaging folks who are trying to engage with the local planning process.
All right. Well, this has been a really great conversation. A lot of good insights. It's always nice to sit down with a group of smart people who are thinking through stuff. So I will be sending out a follow-up survey. It's probably going to go out tomorrow. I'll email that to all of you. And please, if you would respond, that would be very helpful. But also continue to be engaged as you're able to in the rulemaking effort. We really appreciate your time today. Anything else anybody else wanted to add? Sandy?
I'll just say you guys are in a tough spot. You have been doing, I would say DLCD staff has been impressive over the past couple of years of really doing, putting these packets out every time and facilitating the meetings and responding to your commission. I don't envy you, your positions, but I think you all are really doing a great job. And we might get frustrated of what's asked of us and how much we're trying to influence, but none of this is about you personally, and I know you know that, but just appreciate all the work that you all are doing too.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear, Sandy. And yeah, we it's been very challenging for all of us, but I will say to a person, I think every planner we've heard from has said, we're on board with the mission. We support what you're trying to do. We just need to get the details right.
You're providing great job security.
Yeah, that too. All right. Well, thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate the time. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
Nice to see you all.